And I think that really effective business, really effective marketing, or really effective writing is surprisingly simple when you break it down. And that's also true of cooking. It's also true of learning a language. It doesn't, I think complicated fails.
Welcome to The Portfolio Life with Jeff Goins. This is the podcast that helps you to pursue work that matters, make a difference with your art, and discover your true voice. I'm your host, Jared Easley. We are privileged today to listen to an interview that Jeff had with Tim Ferriss, author of great books like The 4-Hour Workweek, The 4-Hour Body, and The 4-Hour Chef. But first, this episode is brought to you by TribeWriters.com. TribeWriters.com is an online writing course that helps writers discover their voice and build a platform that gets them published. You can receive a free lesson by going to TribeWriters.com. And now, Jeff Goins.
Hey everyone, this is Jeff from GoinsWriter.com, and today I'm here with Tim Ferriss. Tim, if you don't know who he is the best-selling author of The 4-Hour Workweek, The 4-Hour Body, and now The 4-Hour Chef. Tim, how's it going?
It's going really well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being a part of this. I'm really looking forward to it. So, right off the bat, just talk a little bit about your book, your new book, The 4-Hour Chef. That might sound like it's a book about cooking, but it's about a whole lot more. Talk about that.
Right. So it's the cookbook for people who don't buy cookbooks,
Right.
In the sense that I tell the story of how to learn any skill through my exploration of food, but the recipe is really this approach to meta learning. So how do you take the same blueprint and learn Spanish in 8 to 12 weeks? How do you take the same blueprint and learn how to play the guitar or shoot a three-pointer in basketball? And this is what my readers have been asking me for 4 or 5 years, because I've tackled all these languages and done horseback archery and kickboxing and tango and whatever. And the question has always been, how do you approach one of these skills and deconstruct it and whatnot? So this book is the answer to that. And super psyched. It's very different from previous books because it has 1,500 plus photos and hundreds of illustrations. So it's a fun one.
Yeah, it's a big book. I saw it like sitting on, I don't know, like your kitchen table or something, and it almost looks like a cookbook, like something you can sort of prop up vertically and it stands, right?
Yeah, it's a choose your own adventure guide. So I don't expect anyone to read more than 100 or 150 pages at a time, but
Yeah.
I hope that people refer back to it constantly for inspiration, fun, tactics, and all that. So it's a big one, 672 pages.
Wow. Yeah, I love I love that nod to the Choose Your Own Adventure series in the 90s. Definitely,
Oh, yeah.
Definitely
My
read.
next door neighbor growing up actually created that series.
No way.
I this is just a fun side
Wow.
story. Is he would have me and my younger brother test out many of his books, and then he would put our names into the books. So if you come across Tim Ferriss popping up in a Choose Your Own Adventure book, it is because Ed Packard had us test his books. Which is pretty fun.
Wow, that's crazy. So, I mean, that's one of like many crazy stories that you have, which I think is can kind of go to my next question. Did you see that movie Limitless?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. NZT, the whole nine yards,
right.
for sure.
Right. So I think some people look at you and say that, you're like that guy. Like you're this guy who, like, maybe without the use of a controlled substance, although I know you've got some stories from college, find ways to basically be awesome at anything. And I love reading stories on your blog of how you're able to connect with, crazy, inaccessible people. Can you just talk about a little bit of your backstory? So you obviously have a curiosity and a fascination with learning. It sounds like you've had some great opportunities, although I think you are an advocate for you can kind of create those opportunities for yourself. Where did all this come from? Where did this fascination with how things work and how to deconstruct them in like the fastest way possible?
There are a few origins to that, and it's funny, of course, when people have the image of me as the guy in Limitless, because I have all of the self-defeating impulses that everybody else has. And what's funny about the bio, I'm also really good at writing my own bio, which is, I think, another trick. But yeah. the vast majority of stuff that impresses people, whether it's the world record in Tango or what have you, all these languages, those all happened in the last few years.
Wow.
And it was because of this process of refining my approach to meta learning, which started with two things. The first was competing in wrestling, collegiate wrestling in high school. And I was born premature. I have very problematic left lung and all sorts of heat regulation issues associated with that. And the question became, all right, well, how can I completely change my approach to wrestling? Because I really couldn't last more than one round or two so that I can win. And that meant that I had to look at the rules. I had to look at, for instance, cutting weight that I got very, very good at, and I used later in kickboxing, like cutting from 193 to 165 in one day, and then hyperhydrating back, which is very challenging, and I don't recommend it. And then secondly, in the mental realm was Japanese, the Japanese language. So I had failed at learning Spanish when I studied it for the first few years in junior high and whatnot, and concluded I was bad at languages. Then in my sophomore year in high school, I had the opportunity to go abroad to Japan. And I ended up, unbeknownst to me, I didn't expect this, getting thrown into a Japanese high school of 5,000 students and going to all of the regular Japanese classes in Japanese. And I couldn't read or write. I couldn't do anything. And I ended up improvising and using comic books and judo textbooks to learn Japanese. And I had to, again, sort of sink or swim, try to figure it out, deconstruct it. The traditional approaches weren't working for me. And I think everything really stemmed from there. But Japan was definitely a major inflection point.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the story isn't, I've always been awesome. The story is, I was in many ways born with, certain weaknesses, and I had to find ways to compensate for them. And some of these, circumstances, force that, even more so.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I'll tell you one other thing that a lot of people don't know about me, and that is that I have dysgraphia, which is not unlike dyslexia, but dyslexia is when you read. I can read just fine.
Yeah.
Dysgraphia is when you write letters upside down, backwards, mix them up with other letters, etc.
Wow.
And so it makes it all the more unusual that I was able to crack the code with something like Japanese, which uses two writing syllabaries, and then Chinese characters.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to underscore what you just said, which is like, I am not the guy from Limitless. I am able to do what I do despite all of the usual impulses and desire to procrastinate and everything else that everybody else feels. So I just have a good system for approaching these things.
Along those lines, what's one of your biggest failures? I mean, your blog and your books, I like that you kind of bear all, but I mean, again, there's sort of these like superhuman feats, and I could see how somebody listening to you or reading your stuff would go, man, I could never do that. I could never be that awesome that quickly, because all of your stuff it's sort of like, yeah, I mean, work 4 hours a week, get in crazy shape, in the least amount of time possible. Can you talk a little bit about failure? Maybe like one thing that didn't work? Oh, sure.
Well, I mean, the catalyst for the 4-hour work week was destroying relationship after relationship with, long-term girlfriends. I thought I was going to get married to one girlfriend. Then she called it quits and was out the door because of my work schedule. So I think that I have a sort of a battlefield of ex-girlfriends who have been lost in the battle, and that's certainly a very high cost type of failure. Secondly, even basic things people don't know about me that are I think I want more people to know. Like, I couldn't even swim until a few years ago.
Wow.
I mean, I grew up on the water, basically on Long Island, and I was terrified of swimming. Couldn't swim, and ultimately figured it out, but had failed many, many times trying to learn to swim and working with coaches who would give me a kickboard. And it was terrifying to me in a real, life-threatening way. So, and there are many other examples, but those would certainly be two that come to mind.
Yeah. When I was telling people that I was going to have this conversation with you, I know you've probably answered this like a million times, but this is like the number one thing that people told me to ask you, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it. Do you really work 4 hours a week?
Okay, I'll answer it two ways.
Okay.
I can work 4 hours a week if I so choose. I can work 0 hours of work if I so choose.
Yeah.
I'm going to be taking all February off and traveling and learning to surf and whatnot. And I just got back from Japan a few weeks ago, so I can choose to do that. But what's important for people to realize is the fundamental goal of the 4-hour work week is to give you control of your time and the highest per hour output possible. Once you have the highest per hour output possible, you can either cut back on the total number of hours worked and get the same amount done, or you can take that and apply it to where you think you can have the most impact, get the most ROI, which is what, for instance, a lot of people in Silicon Valley do when they use the 4-hour work week. They use it to create the 400-hour work week, but they're just getting 10 times more done with each of those hours. So for me, the goal was never being idle, and I think that's a misinterpretation of the book. So right now, this is book launch time. So I am jamming, focusing on 80-20 analysis to really try to change publishing, which means I'm working a lot more than 4 hours a week. Mm-hmm. But I can turn it off. And I think that is what makes the biggest difference, is having the ability to hit pause, to say no, to walk away, and to take a few weeks off, a few months off, a few years off if you want, which is something I can do. I wanted to add one more failure example, which is relevant to this group. So the 4-hour workweek was turned down 26 times before it was bought by a publisher, really violently in a lot of cases. So I think whether something is a failure often is determined by when you give up. Mm-hmm. And you can't see this right now, but I actually have a dog tag around my neck that has a quote from Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was, at one point, after all of his accolades and heroism in World War II, brought to give a commencement speech at a university. And they'd budgeted something like 2 hours for him. Mm-hmm. So there's this really lengthy introduction, very laudatory introduction. And he gets up and he says, "Never, never, never give up." And then he sits down. And that was his entire speech. Yeah. And so I have that etched into a dog tag that I wear around my neck, because sometimes you're just 10 feet from the finish line, and that's when you throw in the towel. You obviously, in some cases, need to know when to stop doing something that doesn't work. But the 4-hour work week was turned down by 26 publishers.
Yeah, and if I remember the story correctly, like, it wasn't an instant success. I mean, you basically had a meager marketing budget and went and went to all these conferences and started hanging out with bloggers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even the blog, people are like, "Oh my God, Tim's blog is so successful," mm-hmm. or not, depending on who's looking at it. But people should Google, old version of Tim Ferriss' website, or go to, I think it may even still be up, cubicleescapeartist.com, I think was the name. And it's terrible. Yeah. It's so bad. It's horribly ugly. The content is kind of garbage, quite frankly. I didn't know what I was doing. Yeah. And we all have that period when we try anything new where you just don't know what the hell you are doing. Yeah. So I'm not immune to that, certainly.
So let's talk about this, kind of more about the book now. So, I watched a video of you on Amazon where you're basically talking about wine, which is this thing that there's a lot of snobbery involved in, talking about tannins and, and legs and, all kinds of things, when a lot of, blue collar normal people go, I like red or white. And I like that you approach things. I mean, you do this with food. You do this with work. You do this with a lot of the way, eating and dieting and getting into shape, how we spend our lives. And you have this kind of blue collar, simple approach to it. And I think it's because you're kind of approaching it as somebody who, like you said, this is a cookbook for cooks, for people who don't cook. So can you talk a little bit about that? Are you conscious of that, or is that just kind of how you approach everything?
It's kind of how I approach everything, but I also grew up in a household with 2 working parents who never made more than $50,000 a year, and we weren't poor and terrible, but I mean, we ate TV dinners. My dad did not drink wine, and great parents. I mean, really wonderful teachers, and created my curiosity for learning, certainly. But I don't come from a fancy place, and so going into the food world, that had always kind of intimidated me, because there are a lot of self-described foodies use it as their religion almost.
Right.
And they want to be the high priests. They don't want other people to understand what's going on necessarily. So it's like all this fancy French vocabulary or all these words applied to wine that nobody understands outside of that world. And it's just not necessary. So you can make it super simple. And, the technique that's in that video was borrowed from Nathan Myhrvold, so former CTO of Microsoft. I went up to visit his food lab in Seattle, had I think it was a 32-course meal in this airplane hangar, basically, where they have like racks and racks of powders and potions. It was like a Willy Wonka. And he was telling me about how this Spanish duke, I think, or some type of royalty from Europe, gave him an extremely expensive bottle of wine. Now, keep in mind, Nathan is a billionaire, so he can get away with a lot. Gave him this extremely expensive bottle of wine. So Nathan poured it into a large beaker, to decant, and then pulled out a hand blender and put it in to aerate it. So instead of leaving it in the decanter to aerate, meaning just expose it to air,
right,
he took out a blender and stuck it in and blended this, like $1,000 bottle of wine. And it does make it taste better. Now, with a $1,000 bottle of wine, you probably don't need to do it. But if you want to take a $10 bottle of wine and make it taste like a $60 bottle of wine, like this is actually a cheat that to most people will make all the difference. And you can also do things like take really cheap bourbon, for instance, and make it taste like it's been aged for 10 years by adding things like liquid smoke and a little bit of vanilla and a little bit of A, B, and C, another handful of things. So it doesn't have to be complicated. And I think that really effective business, really effective marketing, really effective writing is surprisingly simple when you break it down. And that's also true of cooking. It's also true of learning a language. I think complicated fails, but many businesses, many people in general operate on a model of complicate to profit. So if you complicate something enough, like Rosetta Stone, where you have 5 or 6 sets that you have to buy for $400 a piece, then you can make more money. If a personal trainer, for instance, were really, really good, they would make themselves obsolete in the first 1 or 2 sessions. But then they don't make money, so they have to complicate it. But the best path is usually surprisingly simple.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's so true with writing. I was having a conversation with Mitch Joel, who's another blogger, podcaster guy, and we were talking about writing, and he said, really, doesn't it come down to just shut up and write? And I said, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, it could, yeah.
Yeah. I saw a tweet from someone a few weeks ago that said, my favorite productivity hack, sit down and work.
Yeah, right.
Which I thought was great. But even if you look at something that is seemingly complicated, right? Like shooting a 3-pointer in basketball, it's not complicated. And then you can take the same principles and apply it to bowling, which I did not study bowling at all, took the same principles from basketball and then started scoring over 100 for the first time in my life, which is pretty awesome. But you take something like writing, for instance. So there's writing that appears simple, but is surprisingly nuanced. Like, let's say Kurt Vonnegut, right? One of my favorite authors. Then there's writing that appears very, very complex, like John McPhee, for instance. And I was very lucky to have John McPhee, staff writer for the New Yorker, Pulitzer Prize winner, as a teacher at one point. But his writing is just beautifully wordsmithed. It's incredible. I mean, it makes me kind of want to cry about my own writing sometimes. But his structure, the way he structures his writing, which of course most readers never see, it's intended to be kind of invisible, is surprisingly simple. And that is what we focused on a lot in his class, which was called The Literature of Fact. We focused on how to structure your writing so that then it's pretty much just fill in the blanks, like a Mad Lib. But of course, the end product for someone like him is just incredible and appears complex, but the underlying structure, the architecture that produces the result is very simple.
I was just watching another video of yours that you just sent me about the 4-Hour Chef, and I love that it kind of encompasses and embodies this concept of meta learning, learning about learning and how to hack things. And I saw the phrase, how to become world class at anything in 6 months. So you and I were talking before the interview, and you said you weren't or maybe aren't somebody who consider yourself a writer. So, I mean, this is your 3rd book now, right?
Yep.
And the last 2 have been crazy runaway bestsellers, and we know that there was a lot of struggle at the outset. But now I think a lot of writers, a lot of authors, a lot of marketers are looking at you as kind of an example of a pioneer in the field of publishing and writing, and how to take a book and immediately get a lot of attention around it. So how did you, and how do you continue to become world-class at writing, publishing, spreading ideas?
That's a good question. I of course, I'll always aspire to be better. I mean, when I finish every one of my books, I look at it and I'm like, what a piece of junk. Like, I am so depressed. Every time I finish a book, I'm like, man, there's so many things I could have done to make it better. And I just need a little distance to look at it. But in general, I don't have a very high opinion of my own writing. But I do focus on being a good teacher. And the nature of advice, how to, and the type of prescriptive books that I write is that it's teaching on paper. So I think that I'm able to get around maybe my own insecurities as it relates to writing by viewing it that way. But the way that you become world class, and I tend to define that as top 5% in a given field, certainly in the general population, is by asking good questions and by finding people to interview if possible, or reading interviews. For instance, asking someone if you're looking at, let's say, ultra running, right? You might talk to an ultra runner who was famous 5 years ago, so that they're not in the limelight. They're easy to get a hold of. Maybe it costs you $50 for a Skype interview. Who knows? And then you can ask them questions like, what are the most unusual things that you do in your training? Have you had other people use those techniques? What have been the results? Who is really good at ultra endurance running, who shouldn't be, who isn't built for it, right? Because some people look like spiders, they're perfect for it. Yeah. But there are the rare handful who are like 260 and 6'3" and run 100-mile races. So like, how does their training differ? Who are the most controversial coaches? Why are they controversial? What do you think of them? And you can also pose these questions to yourself. So, for instance, and the thinking applies to everything, right? So, what if you took, let's say, a typical dessert, like a creme brulee, and made it an appetizer? How would you make it an appetizer? And there's actually a restaurant that did this that I came across called Lost 25. And they have a cauliflower creme brulee, which is amazing, and it's served as an appetizer. Wow. And what that does is it forces you out of constrained paradigms or rules that everyone follows that are just self-imposed. So, and that's what you have to break out of. You have to realize that the rules that we follow, outside of, let's say, law and science, are self-created. So with the book, for instance, the reason that I had such a tough time writing my first book was I tried to write it from A to Z, start to finish. And it wasn't until a very well-known agent, this was actually advice that she gave me before she declined to take me on as a client, and then signed with my current agent, who was great, Steve Hanselman. But she said, write each chapter like a magazine article. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and be able to stand on its own two legs. So it's not like a tease chapter 1 to get to chapter 2, then tease chapter 2 to get to number 3. Each one should be self-contained. And what that allowed me to do was to write the book out of order. Yeah. I could write the chapters I wanted to write. If I was really stuck and getting depressed about a chapter, I could skip to another chapter. And the side effect of that is that people can read a lot of the book out of order. And that's become a hallmark of my books. I'm like, wow, that actually worked really, really well. So now with the 4-Hour Body, it's not going to be accidental. I'm going to do that on purpose. With the 4-Hour Chef, I'm going to refine it and make it even better. And again, do it on purpose. But the only reason I was able to do that is I made the leap to write a book, to try to write a book in chapters out of order. And it worked. And it forced me to crystallize my thought about each of these subjects. So I think that by testing opposites and posing a lot of what-if questions to yourself, that's the first step to identifying sort of the path of least resistance, the uncommon path to getting very good at what it is you're doing. And I would also say that being well-known and having best-selling books puts you in probably the top 5% of commercially successful writers, certainly. But the easiest way to do that oftentimes is, and this is certainly true in PR and marketing, is to be not only better but different. You have to be different. When you create a new category, when you create a new term, right, like lifestyle design, you own that term. You're not competing against, let's say in that case, time management or work-life balance books or whatever. It is an entirely new category. So I'd encourage people to think along those lines as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, one of the things, sort of the conventional wisdom, and it sounds like one of the ways that you become world-class, and I think this is kind of an old branding technique, is, don't try to beat somebody at, a category that they're already number one at. You're never going to, out Coca-Cola. They've been around forever. They have one of the oldest brands. You're never going to beat them. But you could create a new brand, like an Uncola, for example, like Sprite. So, you've written about business, you've written about weight loss, now you're writing about food, and obviously there's this 4-hour theme to all of your books, but I think that's kind of a no-no. I mean, you're crossing a lot of different genres and probably attracting different readerships through at least those topics. Is there any sort of rhyme or reason to the topics that you're choosing? Is it just what you're passionate about? I mean, I think that you're obviously kind of breaking that rule of, stick in one genre, write a bunch of books, and hopefully, you'll start to build trust with your audience. You've seemingly done the opposite of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So after the 4-hour work week, I could have written the 3-hour work week, but
Right.
There were a few things. I didn't want people to associate me with one subject. I didn't want to get pigeonholed into talking about autoresponders for the rest of my life, for instance.
Yeah.
And I wanted people to follow me for the storytelling, for the writing. So the people that I strive to emulate in that respect are more like the Malcolm Gladwells or the Michael Lewises. Michael Lewis can write a book on baseball, then a book on the financial collapse, and then a book on, it doesn't matter. He could write a book on, labradoodles, and people would buy it because they're like, I don't care about labradoodles, but man, Michael Lewis tells a damn good story. Yeah. I'm going to buy that book on labradoodles. And that's the position I want to be in, because I think that is how you get the most loyal fan base who isn't comparing you to other people in a specific subject area, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so for me, the way that I've chosen my subject matter is actually pretty straightforward. There are things that I am obsessed with on some level, and they're the books that I would have wanted to read myself. So they're books that hadn't existed when I went to find them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the 4-hour work week, you had Jack Welch and all these like win at all cost type of books, but my life was already falling apart. I didn't want more of that. Then you had books that would talk about how you could kind of opt out of society and the economy, and money isn't important because everything you need doesn't require money. And I didn't buy that either. And I was like, man, isn't there anything in between where you don't have to like sell your soul, but you can actually still have income and do the things you want to do and have the things you want to have? It didn't exist. So I sort of set out on doing these hundreds and thousands of experiments and whatnot. And then the 4-hour work week was the result. Same thing with the 4-hour body. It was the book that I felt needed to be written, because there was a huge gap where there was no book like that I would have really wanted to read like 5 years ago, 2 years ago, whatever. Like that's the book I needed, and it didn't exist. And then the 4-hour chef is the same way. I mean, there are some really good cookbooks out there, but there aren't many that are really good at teaching people the skill of cooking, let alone the skill of acquiring other skills. I don't know of any mainstream book that's done that. So I wanted to learn cooking. I wanted to learn to cook. It kicked my ass many, many times in the past. I'd given up many, many times in the past, just like swimming. I was like, you know what? Like if my meta learning process is as refined as I hope it to be, like it should work for cooking. It should work for everything. So why don't I tackle it with all those insecurities still and tell people the full story of going from zero to hopefully much, much better at the end? And I'm not gonna ruin the story, but that's how the books came about. But it's been very organic. And you also really, if you want at least to have a best-selling book, you cannot get easily tired of your subject matter, which is why I never choose subject matter based on hoping it's going to be hot or not. I choose something that I'm truly somewhat obsessed about, or at least extremely fascinated by, because if you're going to have a best-selling book, you can't just build a better mousetrap and wait for people to beat a path to your door. You have to get the word out, and that requires talking about it a lot.
Yeah, what I think is interesting is, I mean, you're basically talking about you're not superhuman, which is I think good and a relief for some of us to hear. And in some ways, hacking your way into something is finding the path of least resistance, or finding the back door is a way to compensate for some, natural inability to do something. And so you're breaking the rules to do the thing that the experts say you have to do it this way. What I think is fascinating about the 4-Hour Chef, real chefs don't really use cookbooks, right? They use instinct. They use, years of training, and yeah, I'm sure they use recipes and whatnot. But I mean, if you watch Emeril or somebody, cooking it up, I mean, it's all by instinct. He's not following the rules. And so I like that you didn't just write a book full of recipes or, go to school, do this, but you're writing it from, I've never really done this, and I've had to kind of find ways to fake or trick my way into getting those same results, like with the wine we were talking about before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the goal of 4-Hour Chef, and I think this, the subtitle's really important. So the simple path to cooking like a pro, learning anything, and living the good life, right? Very narrow scope.
Yeah.
The objective is to make people feel, when I say chef, it's from, jefe, like boss, right?
Yeah.
I want people to feel very self-reliant and self-actualized. And to do that, you have to become very free and independent in a way, which means being able to cook without recipes.
Yeah, right.
And being, feeling like a director in your life in many ways, not just in the kitchen, as opposed to a spectator, or worse still, a victim of sometimes. So, yeah, it's been really fun to analyze, the world's fastest learners and best chefs and see what they have in common, what some of the weirder ones do, and to mold it into something that people can really play around with, like a Lego kit, which has been really fun. I'm very excited about it.
Love that. So this will be our last question. I was surprised to see, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised knowing that, you're always kind of trying to find unconventional ways to do things. But when I heard about the 4-Hour Chef, I don't know, months ago, maybe a year ago, I heard that you were releasing it exclusively through Amazon. Why? And so I know that you're doing some interesting things to promote it, and even kind of getting some resistance. Obviously, Amazon has some major competitors. First of all, why did you choose to do that? And how are you kind of overcoming that resistance to promote it and get it out to as many people as possible?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Amazon Publishing is a very interesting startup within Amazon itself. And so I was the first major acquisition of Amazon Publishing. They launched an office in New York City. They're signing authors and competing directly head-to-head with the traditional publishers. And the reason I signed, there are many reasons, but the main reason is I wanted to try something different. And Amazon is the only publisher, if you think about it, that has a direct line to all of their readers, all of their customers.
Right.
So if you're working with, let's say, Simon & Schuster or whomever, they sell to the head buyer at Barnes & Noble. They sell to the head buyer at Books A Million or whatever it is. They do not have the ability to communicate with their readers. Whereas Amazon, I mean, certainly speaking personally, like they probably know me better than I know myself in a lot of ways. Like they, given my buying behavior and using Amazon Prime for everything, they know their customers really well and they can communicate with them. So that was very fascinating to me, and I wanted to be involved with the startup within a big company that has a lot of resources to see how they could put muscle behind it and do things differently. That's the reason I did it. Now, the book was intended to be available across all platforms in all places.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
But the reality has been, and even though the print book, and this was really, I designed this book to be beautiful. So I looked at it as 2-page spreads. And if you're looking at it digitally, you only get 1 page at a time. So I really designed this to sort of be optimal as a tactile physical experience. But it's being boycotted by Barnes & Noble and 700 plus stores and whatnot.
Wow.
And I anticipated that could happen. And I'm totally okay with it, because if you're going to try new things, you're going to take some lumps. That's just the reality. But I do think that it's definitely the way the book was even put together, certainly the way the book will be launched, is very unusual. And it's worth looking at. I think it's worth watching. Some things will work, some things won't. But I do think that there will be glimpses of what could be the future of publishing. For instance, there's a content swap right now between Amazon Publishing and Crown, Archetype, my previous publisher, where there are samples of the 4-Hour Chef at the end of and in the table of contents of the digital versions of the 4-Hour Workweek and the 4-Hour Body. And then there's a sample of the 4-Hour Body, a really short but fun sample from the 4-Hour Body that highlights some points in the 4-Hour Chef. And that's just never really been done before. I mean, between two competitive publishers to have that type of swap, which is really easy to do by harnessing the power of digital, I think is an example of what's going to be done more and more in the future. But to make up for some of what's going on, I actually do have an offer for people who are interested. And of course, you can go to 4hourchef.com and you can see the videos and samples and all sorts of fun stuff. But if you want to buy 3 print copies of the book, so 1 for yourself and 2 for gifts for Christmas or whatever your holiday might be, it's a beautiful book. So if you buy 3 print copies and send the Amazon receipt to 3 books at 4hourchef.com, just the numerals 3 and 4, but 3 books at 4hourchef.com, then you'll get an invite to an exclusive 2-hour live Q&A that I'm going to do after launch week. And you can ask me anything that you want, whether it's about writing, marketing, anything at all. So for people who are interested, that might be interesting. That might be fun to see them on the interwebs and to answer some more questions.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for making that available. I hope a lot of people take advantage of that. Tim, thanks so much for your time. It really was a pleasure and an honor getting to chat with you and have a little bit of your day.
Yeah, this was fun. I mean, I enjoy talking about writing, and particularly it's because I do find it difficult. So for people out there who are like, "Oh man, I have so much trouble writing," like Tim whips out these books, it's not true. It's not true. I procrastinate. I have to read bird by bird to get my head in the right place over and over again. And it's a worthwhile craft. It's a beautiful, powerful, worthwhile craft, and I enjoy talking about it. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, man. Have a great day.
All right, thanks. You too.
Thank you for listening to Jeff's interview with Tim Ferriss. Please consider tweeting to Jeff to let him know what you thought about the interview. Jeff's Twitter is @JeffGoins. You are invited to visit Jeff's website, goinswriter.com, where you can receive some of his best work for free, including the Writer's Manifesto and the original Wrecked Manifest. Thanks again for listening to the show.
Which means I'm working a lot more than 4 hours a week, but I can turn it off. And I think that is what makes the biggest difference, is having the ability to hit pause, to say no, to walk away, and to take a few weeks off, a few months off.